A 17-year-old boy is stripped naked by his own brothers, thrown into a pit, and sold for 20 pieces of silver. 13 years later, that same boy stands in Pharaoh's palace wearing royal robes, holding absolute power over the most advanced civilization on earth. The slave who saved a nation. This isn't fiction. This is Joseph's story, and it's one of the most psychologically complex tales of betrayal, survival, and redemption ever recorded. But here's what most people miss. Joseph didn't just survive slavery and prison through luck. He employed specific psychological strategies that modern research confirms actually work. And the way he transformed from victim to victor reveals something unsettling about family dynamics, power, and forgiveness that most of us would rather not admit. By the end of this video, you'll understand why Joseph's brothers wanted him dead, how he manipulated an entire empire's economy, and the controversial question scholars still debate today. Was Joseph's forgiveness genuine, or was it the ultimate power move? To understand why Joseph's brothers committed what essentially amounts to attempted murder, you need to understand what it's like growing up in a family where favoritism isn't just obvious, it's weaponized. Joseph's father Jacob had 12 sons from 4 different women. Complex family? That's an understatement. But Jacob made one catastrophic parenting mistake. He didn't even try to hide which son he loved most. He gave 17-year-old Joseph a richly ornamented coat, the kind that screamed, "This one gets the inheritance," in ancient Near Eastern culture. Imagine your dad buying your sibling a Lamborghini while you get nothing, except everyone in town knows about it, because that's the point of the gift. But Joseph made it worse. Much worse. He had dreams, vivid, symbolic dreams where his brothers' sheaves of grain bowed down to his sheaf, where the sun, moon, and 11 stars bowed to him. And Joseph, in what might be the most socially unintelligent move in biblical history, told his brothers about these dreams. Not once, but repeatedly. Here's where the psychology gets interesting. Research from the Journal of Family Psychology shows that parental favoritism doesn't just create resentment. It fundamentally alters sibling relationships in ways that can persist for decades. Children who perceive favoritism show higher rates of depression, anxiety, and yes, aggression toward the favored sibling. Joseph's brothers weren't just annoyed. The text says they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. That's not sibling rivalry. That's a family on the edge of violence. One day, Jacob sends Joseph to check on his brothers who are tending flocks miles away. The brothers see him coming from a distance, probably spotting that distinctive coat, and someone says the words that change everything. Here comes that dreamer. Let's kill him. What happens next reveals something deeply disturbing about group psychology. These aren't strangers or enemies. These are brothers who grew up together, ate together, worked together. Yet when they strip Joseph of his coat and throw him in a cistern, essentially a dry well, to die, they sit down to eat a meal. Think about that. They can hear their brother screaming from the pit, begging for his life, and they're having lunch. This is what psychologists call diffusion of responsibility, when a group commits an act that no individual might do alone. The famous Milgram experiments in the 1960s demonstrated how ordinary people could inflict harm when they felt part of a collective decision. Joseph's brothers had created what we'd now recognize as a mob mentality. But one brother, Reuben, the oldest, has a crisis of conscience. He convinces them not to kill Joseph directly, maybe sell him instead. When a caravan of Ishmaelite traders passes by, most of the brothers sell Joseph for 20 shekels of silver, the going price for a young slave. They slaughter a goat, dip Joseph's coat in blood, and bring it to their father. Jacob's wailing could probably be heard across the camp. A wild animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces. The brothers watch their father grieve for years. They never tell him the truth. Now here's where Joseph's story takes a turn that separates it from typical rags to riches tales. Most stories would have Joseph rescued quickly, given his moment of vindication. Instead, he disappears into Egyptian slavery for over a decade. He's sold to Potiphar, captain of Pharaoh's guard. And this is where we see Joseph's first survival strategy, radical competence. The text repeatedly says the Lord was with Joseph and that he succeeded in everything he did. But reading between the lines, Joseph made himself indispensable. He learned Egyptian language, customs, and administration. He rose to manage Potiphar's entire household. Then comes the incident that nearly destroys him. Potiphar's wife repeatedly tries to seduce Joseph. Day after day, she propositions him. Joseph refuses, whether from genuine moral conviction or pragmatic fear is debated. Finally, she physically grabs him. He flees, leaving his garment in her hand. She uses that garment as false evidence, claiming Joseph assaulted her. Notice the pattern? A garment used as evidence of a crime Joseph didn't commit. Sound familiar? It's the second time a piece of clothing has been weaponized against him. Potiphar throws Joseph into prison, specifically, the prison where the king's prisoners were confined. This detail matters. Joseph isn't sent to just any dungeon. He's in a facility that houses political prisoners, royal officials, people who once had power. And Joseph does it again. He makes himself valuable. He interprets dreams for two fellow prisoners, Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker. The interpretations come true exactly as Joseph predicted. The cupbearer is restored to his position, and Joseph makes one request. Remember me when you get out. The cupbearer forgets him for 2 full years. 13 years after being sold into slavery, Joseph is 30 years old and still in prison. Then Pharaoh has 2 disturbing dreams that Egypt's magicians and wise men cannot interpret. Finally, the cupbearer remembers the Hebrew prisoner who interpreted his dream. Joseph is rushed from the dungeon, shaved, given clean clothes, and brought before the most powerful ruler in the ancient world. Pharaoh describes his dreams: 7 fat cows devoured by 7 gaunt cows, 7 healthy grain heads consumed by 7 scorched ones. Egypt's wise men are stumped because these dreams don't fit their dream interpretation manuals. Yes, ancient Egypt actually had those. But Joseph doesn't just interpret the dreams. He provides actionable policy recommendations. 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of devastating famine. His solution? Appoint someone to collect 1/5 of Egypt's harvest during the good years and store it for the famine. This is brilliant on multiple levels. Joseph is essentially proposing that Egypt become the first ancient superpower to implement a national grain reserve system. And who does Pharaoh choose to manage this? The man who proposed it. At 30 years old, Joseph goes from prisoner to prime minister in a single conversation. But here's what makes this historically credible. Egypt did experience severe famines, and archaeological evidence confirms they had sophisticated grain storage systems. The famine stela, an inscription from much later, describes a 7-year famine during an earlier dynasty. While not confirming Joseph's specific story, it shows that extended droughts were real catastrophic events in Egyptian history. Joseph doesn't just store grain randomly. He builds cities specifically for storage. He organizes a taxation and distribution system. He's implementing economic policy that wouldn't be theorized formally for thousands of years. The 7 years of plenty pass. Joseph has married an Egyptian woman, Asenath, and has 2 sons. He names the first Manasseh, meaning, God has made me forget all my trouble. The second he names Ephraim. God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. Those names reveal Joseph's psychology. He's trying to move forward, to forget his past trauma, to build a new identity. But trauma doesn't work that way. Then the famine begins. It's not just Egypt that's affected. The drought spreads across the entire region. Countries surrounding Egypt send delegations to buy grain. And back in Canaan, Joseph's family is starving. Jacob hears there's grain in Egypt and sends 10 of his sons to buy food. He keeps the youngest, Benjamin, the only other son of his beloved wife Rachel, home, terrified of losing him too. The brothers arrive in Egypt and are brought before the official in charge of grain distribution. They bow down to him, faces to the ground, just like in Joseph's teenage dream. They don't recognize him. 20 years have passed. He's dressed as an Egyptian, speaks through a translator, and holds absolute power. But Joseph recognizes them instantly. And he doesn't reveal himself. Not yet. What Joseph does next has troubled readers for millennia. He accuses his brothers of being spies. He throws them in prison for 3 days. He demands they bring their youngest brother Benjamin as proof of their story, holding Simeon as a hostage. Is this revenge? Justice? A psychological test? When the brothers discuss their situation in Hebrew, not knowing Joseph understands, they say something that reveals they've carried guilt for 20 years. We are being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen. Joseph has to turn away because he starts weeping. He's hearing, for the first time, that his brothers felt guilt, that they remembered his screams from the pit. But he continues the test. He sends them home with grain, secretly returning their silver payment in their sacks. When they discover it, they're terrified. Now they look like thieves. They return to Jacob and tell him the Egyptian official demands to see Benjamin. Jacob refuses. He's already lost Joseph and Simeon. He can't lose Benjamin too. But the famine is severe, and eventually, they have no choice. When the brothers return with Benjamin, Joseph's emotional control nearly breaks. He has to leave the room repeatedly to compose himself. He throws a feast, seats them in birth order, which freaks them out because how could he know? And gives Benjamin 5 times as much food as the others. Then comes the final test. Joseph plants his silver cup in Benjamin's sack and accuses him of theft. The punishment? Benjamin will become Joseph's slave. The others can leave. This is the moment. Will the brothers abandon Benjamin like they abandoned Joseph? Judah, the same brother who originally suggested selling Joseph, steps forward and gives one of the most emotionally powerful speeches in ancient literature. He recounts everything: their father's grief over losing Joseph, his desperate love for Benjamin, the promise Judah made to bring Benjamin home safely. Then Judah says something that changes everything. "Let me remain as your slave instead of the boy. How can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? I cannot bear to see the misery that would come upon my father." Judah is offering to sacrifice his freedom to save his brother. The same man who sold Joseph into slavery is now volunteering for slavery himself to protect Benjamin. Joseph breaks. He orders all his Egyptian attendants out of the room and reveals himself. "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" The brothers are speechless, terrified. The man whose life they destroyed now has absolute power over them. But Joseph's response is complex. He tells them not to be distressed or angry with themselves, that God sent him ahead to preserve life. He's reframing his trauma as having divine purpose, using what psychologists call meaning-making to process suffering. But is this genuine forgiveness or sophisticated manipulation? Some scholars argue Joseph is using religious language to maintain control while making his brothers feel guilty. Others see authentic spiritual transformation. Joseph brings his entire family to Egypt, 70 people total. Jacob finally reunites with the son he thought was dead, and they weep together. Joseph settles them in Goshen, the best land in Egypt, and they survive the remaining years of famine. But the story has one final twist. When Jacob dies years later, the brothers panic. They send Joseph a message claiming Jacob instructed him to forgive them, probably a lie. They throw themselves before him. "We are your slaves." Joseph's response: "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." This statement reveals Joseph's coping mechanism, attributing meaning to suffering. Modern psychology recognizes this as a resilience factor. Studies show that people who can find meaning in trauma have better mental health outcomes than those who can't. But here's what the text never answers. Did Joseph truly forgive, or did he simply recognize that revenge would accomplish nothing? Did his brothers ever forgive themselves? And what does it mean that the preservation of the Israelite people, the foundation of 3 major world religions, came through betrayal, slavery, and suffering? Joseph's story doesn't provide easy answers. It shows us that families can be devastatingly cruel, that trauma can either destroy us or forge us into something unexpected, and that the line between victim and victor isn't always clear. The boy thrown into a pit became the man who saved nations, not despite his suffering, but through surviving it with his humanity intact. And maybe that's the real lesson. It's not what happens to you that defines you. It's who you choose to become when you finally have the power to choose.